Thursday, John 29, 2026. Tonight, one sentence in Washington is doing a lot of work because it's not just a warning to Havana, it's a warning to the rest of the world. President Donald Trump has announced a plan to impose additional tariffs on countries that provide oil to Cuba, while declaring a national security emergency involving the island nation. And the way this was written, especially the phrase directly or indirectly, is what turns this from a Cuba story into a global trade pressure move. It suggests the administration isn't only watching ships and cargo manifests, it's watching the entire chain: middlemen, resellers, routed deliveries, and the quiet deals that keep fuel moving when headlines aren't looking. Here's the core of what was announced. An executive order declares that the policies, practices, and actions of the government of Cuba amount to an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. Based on that emergency declaration, the order lays out retaliatory tariffs on products sold in the United States from any country that directly or indirectly sells or otherwise provides any oil to Cuba. That last part is the power lever, because it doesn't say only Cuba. It says if you're helping Cuba get oil, your own exports into the U.S. may be hit. That's the pressure point, turning the U.S. consumer market into a negotiating weapon. And what makes this even more intense is what the order does not do. It does not announce one clean number, one single tariff rate, or one simple list. There's no easy headline like 25% tariffs starting tomorrow. Instead, it sets up a process that keeps everyone guessing, and that uncertainty is part of the force. Under the order, if a country is found to be selling oil to Cuba, the Secretaries of Commerce, State, Treasury, and Homeland Security, along with the U.S. Trade Representative, will determine whether additional tariffs should be imposed on goods coming into the United States from that country. Then the president will ultimately determine those tariffs. So the threat is real, but the exact penalty is flexible. And flexibility is leverage. It means the administration can scale the response up or down depending on the country involved, the political moment, and how quickly it wants to apply pressure. This is not just a trade move. The order uses national security language, and it lists what it calls Cuba's alliances with Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. By placing those names in the order, the administration is framing Cuba as more than an isolated regional issue. It is presenting Cuba as tied into a wider global adversary network, and that framing is meant to justify stronger actions and faster escalation. Now, when the president was asked about it publicly, he pushed back against one specific interpretation: that he is trying to choke Cuba's economy. Speaking on the red carpet at the Kennedy Center ahead of the premiere of the Melania documentary, he told ABC News he's not trying to do that. He described Cuba as a failing nation, said you have to feel badly for Cuba, and said the country has treated people very badly. He also pointed to Cuban Americans, saying many were treated very badly and would probably like to go back. Then he added a blunt prediction. He thinks Cuba will not be able to survive. That line, "will not be able to survive," is what turns this from policy into a countdown narrative. It's not just about tariffs in a spreadsheet. It's about whether the administration believes Cuba is near collapse, and whether the U.S. is now willing to squeeze anyone helping keep Cuba supplied. At the same event, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick framed it as foreign policy enforcement, making sure allies and friends are aligned with the U.S. approach. His message was that the president wants foreign policy defended by all allies and friends, and he expects the results to be reasonable and sensible, like what he describes as outcomes of other tariffs. But the tension in this story is obvious. Reasonable and sensible is in the eye of the beholder, especially when tariffs are being used as a punishment tool. Because a tariff doesn't hit a government building, it hits products, it hits shipments, it hits companies, supply chains, pricing, and consumer costs, depending on what gets targeted and how high it goes. Another layer that makes this moment sharper: the Supreme Court could issue a decision at any time on the legality of the administration's use of emergency powers to impose tariffs. That matters because this Cuba move is explicitly tied to a national security emergency declaration, placing it right inside the broader fight over whether emergency authority is being used too aggressively to reshape trade policy. In other words, while this order threatens new tariffs, the legal ground underneath the broader tariff strategy is also under scrutiny. That's the kind of overlap that makes markets and foreign governments nervous. Policy moves fast, while legal challenges unfold on a slower track. And then there's the Mexico angle, because this is where the story becomes less theoretical and more immediate. The announcement comes after Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum clarified that her country is still sending oil to Cuba. Trump and Sheinbaum spoke by phone Thursday, and Trump described it as a very productive call that focused on the border, stopping drug trafficking, and trade. That is a major detail because Mexico is not some distant trade partner. It is deeply connected to the U.S. economy. If the administration is serious about the oil to Cuba trigger, Mexico's continued shipments create a test case, not a hypothetical, a live one. Now, does that mean tariffs on Mexico are automatic? Not necessarily, because the order sets up a review and recommendation process. But the pressure is immediate. The message is, this is being watched, and the U.S. reserves the right to respond. If you're a country that sells into the United States, cars, electronics, produce, appliances, textiles, industrial parts, this kind of order forces a calculation. Even if you don't send oil to Cuba directly, you now have to worry about what indirectly means. Is it a third country swap, a re-export, a private firm, a routed shipment that changes paperwork? That single word expands the net, and that's why this feels like a broader escalation. The order is not just about Cuba. It's about forcing external compliance. It's saying if you don't align with U.S. pressure on Cuba, you may pay for it through your access to U.S. consumers. The administration's argument is that Cuba poses an extraordinary threat, and the order says Cuba has taken actions that harm and threaten the United States. It's also not the first time Trump has spoken in collapse terms. He has been issuing warnings over the past few weeks, and he has repeatedly described Cuba as near a breaking point. Earlier this month, he said Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. He also argued that Cuba's income had been tied to Venezuelan oil and suggested that money would dry up. And after the U.S. capture of ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, Trump's warnings to the Cuban government intensified. He said Cuba would not have that money coming in and would not have the income coming in, referring to the economic ties between Venezuela and Cuba. That's the narrative arc the administration is building. Cuba is weak. Cuba is running out of lifelines. And now the U.S. is moving to cut off one of the most important lifelines of all, energy supplies, by making it expensive for other countries to help. And here's where the human reality shows up, beyond policy language. In the imagery associated with this report, drivers are shown waiting in line to refuel at a gas station in Havana on Jan 28, 2026. Fuel lines are not an abstract symbol. They are what happens when energy becomes scarce, when supply is disrupted, or when costs rise. So what does this mean going forward? It means the administration is setting up a tariff tool that can be activated selectively. It can start with warnings and diplomacy, and then, if the administration chooses, hit imports from certain countries with new tariffs. It also means U.S. agencies will now be involved in determining who is supplying oil to Cuba and how that supply is traced. And it means that if the U.S. decides enforcement should be strict, the next phase could involve not just policy announcements, but investigations, determinations, and then tariff decisions. For trade partners, the immediate question becomes, do we adjust our Cuba-related oil posture to avoid tariff risk? For exporters, the question becomes, which categories of goods could be targeted if the president chooses to impose additional tariffs? For the broader public, the question becomes, does this escalate into retaliation, counter tariffs, or diplomatic blowback? Because once tariffs enter the picture, it can become a chain reaction. One side applies penalties, the other side answers, businesses scramble to reroute supply chains, and consumers wonder why prices shift. Even the uncertainty itself can trigger planning changes, because companies don't wait until a tariff hits. They try to anticipate it. That's why tonight's announcement matters. Even without a final tariff number, it's a threat that creates a shadow. And the other reason it matters, it's tied directly to the administration's broader approach, using tariffs as a tool not only for economic negotiation, but for geopolitical alignment. The Commerce Secretary's words about allies and friends were not subtle. The message is, if you are an ally, you should act like one, especially on Cuba. At the same time, the president's public comments show the administration wants to frame this as moral and political, about how Cuba treats people, about Cuban Americans, and about a belief that Cuba cannot survive under current conditions. Those statements set the tone for how the policy will likely be defended, as pressure on a government, not as punishment of ordinary people, though critics often argue the impact can still fall heavily on civilians when energy becomes scarce. As of tonight, the move is clear in structure: emergency declaration, broad eligibility for retaliatory tariffs, a multi-agency review process, and then a final presidential decision. What remains unclear, by design, is the tariff rate, the scope of goods, and the speed of enforcement. But the headline for viewers is simple: the White House is linking oil shipments to Cuba with the risk of tariffs on imports into the United States. And by using the words directly or indirectly, it is casting a much wider net than a single shipping route. So the next question is not just what Cuba does, it's what everyone else does. Do countries reduce or stop oil flows to avoid confrontation? Do they challenge the order or its enforcement? Do they negotiate exemptions, or do they keep shipments moving and test whether the U.S. actually pulls the tariff trigger? Because once an order like this exists, it becomes a standing threat, ready to be activated. And that changes behavior long before the first tariff is announced. In the hours and days ahead, watch for three things. First, how the administration defines and proves indirect oil provision. Second, whether any country is formally identified as falling under the order's trigger. And third, whether the trade and security teams recommend a limited tariff move or a broader one. Tonight, the message from Washington is that Cuba is now being treated as an emergency-level issue, and trade penalties are the tool being positioned to enforce U.S. policy. Whether it becomes a targeted warning or a major tariff escalation will depend on what the administration does next and how the world responds.